In the 1940s, Billy Taylor had it all. He was a Stanley Cup champion, a record holder, and a rising star in the NHL. But in a moment, it all came crashing down. Drawn to the underworld of gambling, he committed the unforgivable sin in sports, betting on games. The punishment was more than a ban, it was an erasure. His name was erased from history, his legacy forgotten. This is the story of the price of a bad decision, and how one of hockey's brightest talents became a ghost. To truly understand how a man like Billy Taylor could rise so high and fall so far, you have to shed everything you know about modern professional sports. You have to travel back in time, to the National Hockey League of the 1940s. The NHL of that era was a smaller, tougher, and profoundly different universe. It was a 6-team league, a tight, closed circuit of cities, connected by long, rattling train rides through the Canadian winter and the American Northeast. Toronto, Montreal, Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit. That was it. The entire league. The rivalries were not manufactured for television. They were visceral, born of seeing the same hated faces a dozen times a season. The players knew each other, and they often despised each other. The competition for a roster spot was savage. There were only about 120 jobs in the entire league, and a legion of hungry young men in farm towns and city slums, desperate to take one. The men who held those jobs were not celebrities in the way we understand it today. They were working-class heroes, almost exclusively Canadian, products of the Great Depression. They had grown up with hardship etched into their families' faces. They played with a ferocity born of necessity. A career in hockey was a ticket out of the mine, the factory, or the farm. But it was a fragile ticket. There was no players' union to protect them. The owners were autocrats, men like Toronto's Conn Smythe or Boston's Art Ross, who ruled their franchises like personal fiefdoms. They held all the power. They could trade a player, cut him, or send him to the minors on a whim, and the player had no recourse. The financial reality of their lives was stark. A star player in the mid-1940s might earn between $5,000 and $9,000 for a season's work. While that was a good living compared to the average wage, it was not life-changing wealth. A single, career-ending injury, a common occurrence in this brutal, helmetless era, could plunge a player and his family into poverty overnight. Consequently, almost every player had to work in the off-season. They went home and sold cars, worked construction, farmed the land, or, like the legendary Maurice Richard, worked as a machinist. They returned to training camp in the fall with calloused hands and a deep-seated anxiety about their future. This constant financial precarity created a unique culture. The players were more accessible, more enmeshed in the cities they played for. They lived in modest apartments, not gated mansions. They drank in the same bars as the fans and the local newspapermen. And, crucially, they mingled with the city's gamblers. In the 1940s, sports betting was an open secret, an enormous, illegal enterprise that thrived in the shadows of every major city. Bookmakers were well-known figures in certain circles, and they understood the value of information. They also understood the vulnerability of the players. A player, anxious about a bonus or struggling to make a down payment on a house, might be an easy target. The line between a friendly chat about an upcoming game and a more sinister transaction was dangerously thin. Looming over all of this was the ghost of the 1919 Black Sox scandal, when 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were accused of throwing the World Series for a gambler's payoff. That event had nearly destroyed baseball, and the commissioners of every professional sport lived in mortal fear of a similar catastrophe. They knew that the entire foundation of their business rested on a single sacred belief, that the games were real, that the outcomes weren't fixed. Any threat to that belief, no matter how small, had to be eradicated with extreme prejudice. This was the world Billy Taylor inhabited. A world of incredible pressure, modest rewards, and ever-present temptation, all presided over by a league that valued its public image above all else and was prepared to dispense merciless justice to anyone who threatened it. William Billy Taylor was born in 1919, a child of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, but grew up a child of Cabbagetown. To a modern Torontonian, the name evokes images of beautifully restored Victorian homes and trendy cafes. But in the early 20th century, it was one of the city's poorest and toughest slums. It was a sprawling, hardscrabble neighborhood of Irish immigrants, a place of poverty and grit where families struggled to put food on the table. The name itself was a marker of this poverty. Residents were said to be so poor they grew cabbages on their front lawns. For a boy like Billy, life was circumscribed by these realities. But like for so many Canadian kids, the frozen ponds and the makeshift street rinks offered a form of escape, a theatre of dreams. Hockey was more than a game. It was a potential passport to a different life. And from the moment he first laced up a pair of skates, it was obvious that Billy Taylor had a special gift. He wasn't a dazzling skater or a bruising physical presence. His genius was quieter, more cerebral. He was a playmaker, a puppeteer on the ice. He possessed an uncanny spatial awareness, a sixth sense for the flow of the game. He saw passing lanes that no one else did, threading the puck through a forest of skates and sticks onto the tape of a teammate's blade. His talent carried him out of hometown and into the highly competitive world of junior hockey. He starred for the famed Oshawa Generals, a powerhouse club that was a breeding ground for future NHL legends. Playing there, his reputation grew. Scouts from his hometown team, the Toronto Maple Leafs, took notice. For a kid from a slum, playing for the Leafs wasn't just a dream, it was salvation. In 1939, at the age of 20, he broke into the NHL. But just as his career was beginning, the world plunged into war. Like so many young men of his generation, Billy Taylor answered the call. He put his hockey career on hold and enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force, serving for 2 years. When he returned to the Maple Leafs for the 1941-42 season, he rejoined a team loaded with talent. He was a supporting actor in a cast of superstars like Captain Sil Apps and high-scoring winger Gordie Drillon. Taylor embraced his role as a dependable, intelligent two-way centerman. That season, the Leafs embarked on a playoff run that would become the stuff of hockey folklore. They reached the Stanley Cup finals against their arch-rivals, the Detroit Red Wings. The series was a catastrophe. The Leafs were outplayed, outmatched, and outscored, quickly falling behind 3-0 in the best-of-7 series. It was over. No team in the history of the Stanley Cup or any major North American sport had ever come back from such a deficit. Heading into Game 4 in Detroit, facing elimination, Leafs coach Hap Day made a desperate gamble. He benched several of his veterans, including star scorer Gordie Drillon, and dramatically shook up his lines. He inserted the 23-year-old Billy Taylor onto a new line with rookie Don Metz and his brother Nick. The move was electric. Taylor's playmaking chemistry with the Metz brothers was immediate. The Leafs won Game 4, 4-3. They came home and won Game 5, 9-3. They went back to Detroit and won Game 6, 3-0. Suddenly, impossibly, the series was tied. Game 7 at Maple Leaf Gardens was a pressure cooker of historic proportions. Detroit scored first, but the Leafs, riding an unbelievable wave of momentum, stormed back. They won the game 3-1, completing the single greatest comeback in hockey history. Billy Taylor, who was just a role player a week earlier, was a Stanley Cup champion. He had played a crucial part in a miracle. Despite this monumental victory, his time in Toronto was limited. He was a good player, but the Leafs were deep with talent. In 1945, he was part of a major trade that sent him to the Detroit Red Wings. After just over a season in Detroit, he was on the move again, this time to the Boston Bruins for the 1946-47 season. And it was in Boston, at the age of 27, that Billy Taylor finally emerged from the shadows and had the season of his life. He was placed at center on a line with two beloved Bruins, Milt Schmidt and Woody Dumart. Because of their German heritage, the press had dubbed them the Kraut Line, a moniker that was common and casually accepted at the time. Playing between these two future Hall of Fame wingers, Taylor's elite playmaking skills were finally put on full display. He was the perfect pivot for them, the distributor who made the entire line click. He was no longer a supporting actor. He was a star. On the night of March 16, 1947, he delivered his masterpiece. In a game against the Chicago Blackhawks, Billy Taylor put on a passing clinic. Goal after goal, his teammates found the back of the net, and on every one, he was the setup man. By the end of the night, he had assisted on 7 of his team's goals, setting a new, all-time NHL record for the most assists in a single game. It was a stunning individual achievement, a testament to his unique vision and skill. He finished that season with 17 goals and a staggering 46 assists for 63 points, placing him in the top 10 of league scoring. He was an NHL All-Star. He was a Stanley Cup winner, a record holder, and one of the premier setup men in the game. He had reached the peak. It must have felt like all the years of struggle had finally paid off. But the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crumble. In a move that surprised many, the Bruins traded him that off-season to the perpetually struggling New York Rangers. He was heading to the Big Apple, a city of dazzling lights and deep shadows, completely unaware that he was walking toward a cliff. The New York Rangers of the 1947-48 season were the league's sad sacks. They were a team mired in mediocrity, playing in the cavernous Madison Square Garden to increasingly frustrated crowds. For Billy Taylor, arriving from a contender like Boston, the move must have felt like a form of exile. The atmosphere was one of quiet desperation. On this struggling team was a 22-year-old forward named Don Gallinger. He was a talented kid, a former first overall draft pick who was considered one of the Rangers' few bright spots for the future. Taylor, now 29, was the seasoned veteran, brought in to provide some stability. The two, the veteran playmaker and the young hopeful, struck up a friendship. The exact genesis of the conspiracy is lost to the smoky backrooms of history, but the key figure was a man named James Tamer. Tamer was a Detroit-based gambler with a criminal record and known ties to the city's underworld. He was exactly the type of person the NHL dreaded. Tamer understood the psychology of the game and its players. He knew about their low salaries, their anxieties, and their temptations. Somehow, he made contact with Billy Taylor, the man he likely knew from his time playing for the Red Wings. The proposition Tamer offered was simple and insidious. He wasn't asking Taylor to throw games. He was asking for something much more subtle. He wanted inside information. More than that, he offered to place bets for Taylor. The early wagers were small, a few $100 here and there, placed on other teams around the league. But soon, the arrangement escalated. Taylor, acting as the go-between, brought his younger friend, Don Gallinger, into the fold. And then, they crossed the ultimate line. They began placing bets, through Tamer, against their own team. Their rationalization, as they would later claim, was that the Rangers were a terrible team anyway. They were likely to lose these games regardless, so why not make some money on the inevitable? It's the kind of flawed logic that desperation breeds. In their minds, as long as they were still trying their best on the ice, they weren't truly betraying the game. They were just hedging their bets. But the secret began to fester. Mel Hill, a former teammate of Taylor's from Boston who was also now on the Rangers, later provided a crucial piece of testimony. He told investigators that before a game against the Bruins, Taylor had approached him with a loaded suggestion: "You can make some money if you bet on Boston tonight." Hill, to his eternal credit, wanted no part of it. He refused. But, crucially, he adhered to the unspoken law of the locker room. You don't rat out a teammate. He kept his mouth shut. The whispers, however, had already started. Other players and team officials began to notice things. A strange lack of intensity in a key moment. An unusual passivity. The rumours eventually slithered their way out of the locker room and up the chain of command, finally landing on the desk of the most powerful man in hockey, NHL President Clarence Campbell. Campbell was no ordinary sports executive. He was a lawyer, a Rhodes Scholar, and a decorated veteran of World War II, where he had served as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crime trials. He had stared down Nazi war criminals. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity, stern discipline, and zero tolerance for anything he perceived as a threat to the institutions he served. When the rumours about Taylor and Gallinger reached him, he acted not like a league administrator, but like the prosecutor he once was. He launched an immediate secret investigation. He gathered evidence, phone records showing calls between Taylor and the known gambler Tamer in Detroit, testimonies from people who had overheard suspicious conversations. Then, he summoned the two players to his office in Montreal for separate, intense interrogations. He laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece. He was not there to hear excuses. He was there for a confession. Under the weight of Campbell's interrogation and the mountain of evidence, their stories fell apart. Taylor admitted to his association with Tamer and to placing the bets. Gallinger, younger and likely terrified, confessed as well. They pleaded their case, insisting they had never intentionally played poorly to lose a game. They argued that they had always given their all for the Rangers. For Clarence Campbell, this distinction was utterly and completely meaningless. The act of betting against your own team was the ultimate sin. It shattered the sacred trust that was the bedrock of the sport. It didn't matter if they tried to win. By placing that bet, they had created a conflict of interest so profound that it tainted every single moment they were on the ice. They had invited the devil into the sanctuary of the game. On March 9th, 1948, the hammer fell. Campbell's verdict was swift, absolute, and designed to echo through the ages. In a press release that stunned the sports world, he announced that Billy Taylor and Don Gallinger were suspended from the National Hockey League and expelled for life. Campbell's statement was a thunderclap. The National Hockey League cannot and will not tolerate players who, by their association with known gamblers or by their own gambling activities, bring the game of hockey into disrepute. Such misconduct is a definite menace to the game and will not be tolerated. The expulsion of Taylor and Gallinger is a duty I owe to hockey. The shockwave was immediate. 2 careers were vaporized in an instant. Billy Taylor, Stanley Cup champion and NHL record holder, was now a pariah. He and Gallinger were the first players in league history to be given a death sentence for gambling. The doors to the only world they had ever known were slammed shut, bolted and barred forever. They were now ghosts, banished to hockey's outer darkness. The pronouncement of a lifetime ban was not just rhetoric. It was a complete and total excommunication from the world of professional hockey. Billy Taylor was instantly stripped of everything that had defined him. He was no longer a Ranger, no longer an NHL player. He was a non-person. The ban was comprehensive. He couldn't play, coach, scout, manage, or hold any position, no matter how menial, with any team affiliated with the league. The financial fallout was immediate and devastating. His hockey salary, the primary source of income for his family, vanished overnight. He was cast out into the regular workforce with a public disgrace attached to his name. The man whose hands were once skilled enough to set an NHL passing record now had to find work that required a different kind of dexterity. He became a painter. He worked in a warehouse. He took whatever manual labor jobs he could find to make ends meet. It was honest work, but it was a brutal, humbling descent from the heights he had known. He went from being a celebrated athlete, a name in the papers, to a faceless laborer, his past a source of deep shame he likely rarely spoke of. The emotional and psychological toll was surely even greater. Hockey had been the organizing principle of his entire existence since he was a boy skating on the frozen puddles. It was his craft, his passion, his social circle, his identity, and in a single day, it was all taken away. The camaraderie of the locker room, the thrill of stepping onto the ice in front of thousands of fans, the unique feeling of being part of a team, all of it was gone, replaced by a profound and isolating silence. Years later, his co-conspirator, Don Gallagher, gave a rare interview that shed some light on their mindset at the time. "I figured a year, maybe two," Gallagher recalled. "I was 22 years old. They weren't going to throw my life away for a mistake." That heartbreaking quote reveals the naivety of their position. They thought they had made a mistake that warranted a suspension. They could not comprehend that the league saw their actions as an unforgivable stain, a cancer that required radical excision. They hoped for a second chance, for a path to redemption that simply did not exist. Over the ensuing decades, both Taylor and Gallagher quietly and repeatedly appealed for reinstatement. They wrote letters to Clarence Campbell and later to his successors, expressing their profound remorse. They weren't asking to play again. They were old men by then. They were asking for forgiveness. They were asking to be allowed back into the community in some small way. Each and every time the answer was a cold, formal, and unwavering no. The league had made them into symbols, and symbols are not granted parole. Perhaps the most insidious part of the punishment was the way their legacies were methodically erased. History is written by the victors, and in this case, the league was the victor. When stories were told of the legendary 1942 Maple Leafs comeback, Billy Taylor's crucial role in sparking that miracle was often minimized or omitted entirely. His record-setting 7-assist game remained in the official statistics, a fact too stubborn to be erased. But the man who achieved it became a footnote, his name forever linked to the scandal rather than the accomplishment. Worse still, he was completely cut off from the benefits that his fellow players would one day enjoy. When the NHL established a pension plan, a crucial financial lifeline for players of that era in their old age, Taylor was deemed ineligible. He was denied the security that he had earned over hundreds of games of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as his former teammates aged into celebrated alumni, their numbers retired, their plaques hung in the Hall of Fame. He was left with nothing but the fading memories of a life that had been snatched away, condemned to live in relative poverty and obscurity, a quiet, lonely existence haunted by a single, catastrophic mistake. The long-term impact of the Billy Taylor scandal resonated for generations. It succeeded in its primary goal. It terrified players away from gambling. His name and Gallagher's became a hockey ghost story, a whispered warning to rookies about the career-ending consequences of associating with the wrong people. For over 70 years, an impenetrable wall stood between the NHL and the world of sports betting. The league's stance was clear, absolute, and backed by the ultimate threat of expulsion. Billy Taylor's end came quietly, in stark contrast to the bright spotlight in which he had once shone. He died on October 12, 1990, in Parry Sound, Ontario, after a battle with cancer. There were no league-wide memorials, no eulogies from NHL bigwigs, and no moment of silence at Maple Leaf Gardens, where he had been a hero. His death was like much of his post-ban life, a private event, largely invisible to a hockey world that had long since abandoned him. While his former teammates, Leafs legends, died with great honours and were buried like kings, Billy Taylor died a common man. It was the final and most painful confirmation of his pariah status, a hockey veteran dying in quiet exile in his own country. The reaction of fans in 1990 was not a nationwide outpouring of grief, but rather a ripple in the memories of a fading generation. For those who had actually seen him play in the 1940s, the news of his death may have evoked a sense of wistful nostalgia. They remembered the wizard of passing, the intelligent Stanley Cup champion, before the scandal engulfed them all. For them, it was a regret for wasted talent, a reminder of what might have been. Ultimately, Billy Taylor's legacy isn't the record he set on the ice, but the devastating price he paid for his mistake. His story became a harrowing lesson about the limits of forgiveness, and a warning that a single bad decision can erase a lifetime of achievement. He was denied the chance to redeem himself. His complicated life turned into a simple, harsh, cautionary tale, forever remembered not for his brilliance, but for his worst moment.